What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe animals deserve love, not pain, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. A subscribe is equal with a donation. They were meant to disappear, forgotten by the world, swallowed by the storm. But fate had other plans. The blizzard screamed through the Montana wilderness like a beast mourning its own lost soul. Snow fell in relentless sheets, erasing roads, memories and regrets alike. On this night, as the wind howled over Silver Creek, one man wandered headlong into the storm, not searching for salvation, but trying to outrun the ghosts that haunted every corner of his fractured mind. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe animals deserve love, not pain, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. A subscribe is equal with a donation. The wind howled like a wounded beast over the frozen plains of Montana, whipping through the desolate town of Silver Creek. Snow fell in thick sheets, swirling in angry gusts that erased footprints as fast as they appeared. Under the pale glow of the street lamps, the town seemed deserted, a forgotten relic buried beneath winter's merciless hand. Silver Creek wasn't much a scattering of weathered log cabins, a closed diner with its flickering neon sign, barely clinging to life, and a chapel whose bell hadn't rung in years. Logan Hayes moved through this storm like a ghost from another life. Tall and lean, with a wiry strength forged through years of war, his shoulders hunched beneath a battered military-issue parka, the kind that still bore faded patches from his time in Afghanistan. His gaunt face was chiseled from hardship, angular and sharp, with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow clinging to his jaw. His steel-gray eyes, once bright and full of promise, now held a distant, haunted look, as if they were forever locked on a battlefield no one else could see. Each scar etched into his weathered hands told a story of survival, though survival had long since lost its meaning for him. For Logan, the war hadn't ended when he left Afghanistan. It lived in his mind, in the thunder of remembered gunfire, in the faces of brothers lost under a sky choked with dust and despair. Every night, the nightmares returned like a relentless enemy. Tonight, he couldn't sleep. Again. So, he did what he always did. When the darkness inside grew too loud, he walked. The snow crunched under his heavy boots, the sound muted by the relentless storm. He welcomed the biting cold, the sting of ice against his skin, anything that reminded him he was still alive. His path led him beyond the town's edge, down an old gravel road that cut through the pines like a forgotten scar. As he neared Miller's Creek Bridge, a place long abandoned and half collapsed under the weight of forgotten years, something unusual caught his eye. Amid the pristine white snow, a dark streak marred the untouched surface. Blood. Logan froze. His soldier's instincts dulled, but not dead kicked in. His breathing slowed, eyes sharp. Despite the swirling snow, he followed the trail. Each step brought him closer to something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. The wind wailed through the skeletal remains of the trees, and the air tasted of iron. Then he saw it. Half buried beneath a mound of drifted snow lay a creature that barely resembled the proud animal it once was. A German shepherd, its coat matted with ice and blood ribs jutting painfully through its mud-caked fur. A thick, rusted chain was wrapped tightly around its neck, the broken end disappearing into the snow like some cruel anchor. Its body shivered violently, but its eyes, those wild amber eyes, locked onto Logan's with a haunting familiarity. Logan knelt slowly, his heart pounding. This dog wasn't just dying. It had been discarded, left to face the storm alone, with no more than the cruel memory of captivity. He saw in those eyes a mirror to his own torment, an unspoken understanding of what it meant to be abandoned by the very hands that once offered trust. The dog tried to rise but collapsed again, a low whimper escaping its cracked and bloodied lips. Logan reached out his fingers, trembling as they brushed against the dog's frost-bitten muzzle. "You're not dying here," Logan muttered through clenched teeth, his voice rough from disuse but laced with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. Not today. He worked quickly. With practiced hands, he freed the chain from the dog's neck, cradled the fragile body against his chest, and wrapped his thick parka around it. The dog's head lolled against his shoulder, its breath shallow and weak, but Logan could feel the faintest thrum of life still fighting beneath its battered ribs. The walk back was a battle against the storm itself. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the animal in his arms both a burden and a promise. He wasn't letting go. Not this time. By the time Logan reached his cabin, a lonely structure perched at the edge of Silver Creek's wilderness, his legs burned from exhaustion and his arms ached from holding the fragile creature so close. The cabin was modest, built from dark pine logs with a sloping tin roof. A single window glowed faintly with the light of a dying fire inside. He kicked open the door, the warmth of the hearth barely reaching the threshold. Laying the dog gently on an old woolen blanket near the fire, he worked methodically to bring it back from the brink. Warm water bandages torn from his own shirt sleeves, a battered first aid kit from his military days. As the storm raged outside, Logan sat by the dog's side, his rough hands trembling as he dabbed away the blood and dirt. He didn't even know if the poor creature would survive the night, but he stayed there watching its chest rise and fall, counting every fragile breath like it was a victory. In the faint glow of the fire, Logan studied the dog's injuries more carefully. Its left ear was torn, a jagged scar ran down its hind leg, and one of its paws looked swollen and raw, likely from struggling against the cruel chain that had bound it. Yet, despite the agony written in every line of its battered body, that stubborn spark remained in its eyes. A survivor, like him. Logan took a deep, shaky breath. Blaze, he whispered, naming the dog without thinking. It felt right, like a flicker of warmth against the frozen emptiness inside him. That's your name now, soldier, and I swear, you'll make it through this. Outside the blizzard howled on, but inside that small, forgotten cabin, hope stirred, fragile and trembling, but alive. The fire had long since died down, leaving behind only a soft, glowing bed of embers. The first pale hints of dawn crept across the frost-laced window panes of Logan's cabin, but the storm outside still howled like the echoes of a distant battlefield. Logan Hayes hadn't slept. His weary eyes remained fixed on Blaze, the battered German shepherd, curled against the faded wool blanket near the hearth. Each shallow breath the dog took felt like a battle won against death itself. Then, without warning, Blaze's body stiffened. A low, agonized whimper slipped through his cracked lips as his limbs convulsed violently. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Logan lurched forward, panic flaring through his chest. His hands, those same hands that had once field-dressed wounds under mortar fire, now trembled as he tried to steady the dog. "Stay with me, soldier." Logan rasped his voice, breaking through the memories crashing down on him like enemy fire. He pressed his palm gently against Blaze's heaving chest, feeling the frantic, uneven heartbeat beneath the scars. But Logan knew he couldn't fight this alone. Throwing on his coat, he lifted Blaze into his arms once again. Without hesitation, he pushed through the biting wind and snow, his boots sinking deep into the frozen earth as he made his way to the only person who might be able to save this creature, Dr. Emily Carter. The clinic sat on the outskirts of Silver Creek, a modest two-story building built from pale stone and cedar beams. The hand-painted sign above the door read, Silver Creek Veterinary and Wildlife Rescue. Despite the early hour, a single light glowed warmly from the upstairs window. Logan pounded on the door with his free hand. Moments later, the door creaked open, and there stood Dr. Emily Carter. Emily was in her late 30s, with an ageless beauty carved from resilience and quiet strength. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a messy bun, and despite the hours she wore, a simple navy sweater and worn jeans tucked into weathered brown boots. Her green eyes, sharp and intelligent, softened immediately when they landed on Blaze. Her face bore faint lines that hinted at grief far older than her years, and a thin silver bracelet on her wrist jingled faintly as she reached out a keepsake from the family she had lost years ago in a tragic accident. "Bring him in quickly," she ordered, her voice low and commanding, laced with a calm urgency that only years of working on the edge of life and death could bring. Inside the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar wood. Logan laid Blaze on a metal examination table, his heart pounding against his ribs as Emily worked with precision. Her hands moved quickly, checking the dog's vitals, prying open his mouth to examine the foam, her brows furrowed deeply. "He's seizing, poisoning, but it's not fresh. This has been in his system for days," she muttered. Logan's fists clenched at his sides. "He was chained out there, in the storm, left for dead. Emily shot him a sharp glance. Do you know where he came from? No, just found him out by Miller's Creek. Logan replied, his voice flat distant, as if speaking from 1,000 miles away. Emily administered a syringe of medication, carefully inserting a line for fluids. You'll need to pray, she murmured. I've done enough of that, Logan said bitterly, his voice nearly lost in the soft whimper Blaze let out. But as the words left his mouth, he realized that wasn't true. He hadn't really prayed in years, not since Afghanistan, not since Ethan. Emily continued working her every movement deliberate. As she cleaned the matted fur and inspected the deep lacerations along Blaze's hind leg and flank, her voice softened. He's been through more than just the cold, she said grimly. See these scars? They're not from accidents. He's been trained, forced, likely for fighting. Logan swallowed hard, the bile rising in his throat. The memories of young soldiers twisted by war, their eyes hollow, their humanity stripped away, came flooding back. It was then that soft footsteps echoed from the back of the clinic. A small figure stood in the doorway, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit. Sophie Carter, Emily's daughter, no more than 7 years old, with golden blonde hair cascading over her shoulders in gentle waves. Her pale blue eyes were wide, innocent, but somehow deeply knowing. Sophie had been silent since the car accident that claimed her father's life 3 years ago. She hadn't spoken a word since the day she watched her father's casket lower into the frozen earth. Emily turned briefly, her features softening. Sweetheart, you should be resting. Sophie didn't respond, but her gaze fixed on Blaze's trembling body. She walked quietly to the examination table, her small hands reaching out without fear. Gently, she pressed her tiny palm against Blaze's head, fingers brushing the torn ear as if to soothe away his pain. A moment passed. Blaze, though racked with spasms, stilled beneath her touch. His breathing slowed, the tension in his muscles eased, and for the first time since Logan had found him, his eyes fluttered open, focusing faintly on the child before him. Logan stood in silent awe, his chest tight with a pain he couldn't name. In Sophie's fragile presence, something beyond words passed between the broken dog and the silent child. It was a connection forged not through speech, but through a shared understanding of loss too great to carry alone. Emily watched with tears brimming in her eyes. She's always had a way with the wounded, she whispered, even before she lost her voice. Logan turned his eyes back to Blaze. He could feel something shifting inside him, a crack forming in the hardened walls he'd built around his heart. Will he make it? He asked, his voice raw. Emily took a long, steadying breath. I don't know, she admitted. It's up to him now. And maybe up to her, too. Outside, the storm began to subside. For the first time in what felt like forever, the wind fell silent, and through the parting clouds, a pale dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains of Montana. The Montana winter had a cruel way of lingering, even as the days stretched toward spring. Snow still blanketed the ground around Silver Creek like a shroud, and the air remained razor-sharp against the skin. Logan Hayes stood outside his cabin, watching the pale morning light filter through the jagged outlines of the pine forest. His breath hung visibly before him, curling into nothingness like the memories he couldn't outrun. Inside, Blaze rested on the worn blanket by the hearth. His wounds were healing, but something far deeper remained raw and untended. Every sharp sound, the creak of the old floorboards, a log popping in the fire, made his body jerk upright, eyes wide, searching for threats that weren't there. His ears twitched constantly, torn left ear flicking nervously, and his breathing quickened at every unfamiliar noise. Logan understood. He lived that same nightmare, only his came when his eyes were open. That afternoon, Logan decided to take Blaze outside. It was the first time the dog had seen the sun in days. The snow had hardened into brittle ice beneath their boots and paws crunching underfoot as they walked toward the edge of the woods. Blaze moved cautiously, his steps uncertain, every crackling twig beneath his paws, a fresh reminder of whatever horrors had forged his fear. As they approached a clearing, a sudden gust of wind rattled a loose sheet of metal hanging from the skeletal remains of an old equipment shed. The metallic clang rang out sharp and cold across the empty land. Blaze immediately dropped low to the ground, his entire body trembling, tail tucked between his legs. His amber eyes darted wildly, and a low guttural growl rumbled from his chest. Logan crouched beside him, his large scarred hands resting gently on the dog's shivering shoulders. "Easy, soldier," he whispered. His voice was low and steady, the same tone he'd once used to calm a terrified young private pinned under rubble during a firefight in Kandahar. "There's no war here. Not anymore." Blaze lifted his eyes to Logan's, and for a brief second the panic ebbed. The dog took a shaky step forward, head low, but didn't collapse back into fear. Logan nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. It was progress, no matter how small. Later that day, as twilight draped the mountains in shadows, Logan returned to the cabin and found himself locked once again in his own memories. The faces of the men he'd lost flickered behind his eyes every time he closed them. The screams, the smoke, the chaos, it all replayed in relentless clarity. He pressed the heels of his hands into his temples, his breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. Blaze, lying quietly nearby, sensed the change immediately. Without hesitation, the dog rose and padded softly to Logan's side. He settled his weight against Logan's leg and pressed his head into the man's lap, his warm breath steady against Logan's cold, shaking hands. For the first time since his return from Afghanistan, Logan let his guard down. He buried his hands in the thick, warm fur of the dog beside him, and the tears came unbidden, silent, bitter, but freeing. He wasn't alone anymore. The days passed, and with each one a fragile bond formed between them. Blaze still flinched at loud noises, but his recovery was no longer just physical. It was emotional, visible in the way he began to trust the soft touch of Logan's hand, or how he lay closer to the fire without fear. One quiet morning, Logan decided to visit the town for supplies. Against his instincts, he took Blaze with him. The people of Silver Creek had always kept their distance from Logan, a mixture of respect and fear for the soldier who had returned home, but never truly came back. As Logan stepped into the old mercantile, a small bell chimed above the door. The air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and aged wood. Behind the counter stood Ellie Winters, the store's owner. Ellie was a woman of striking presence despite her modest appearance. Tall and slender, with sharp cheekbones and deep brown eyes that had witnessed more hardship than she ever spoke. Ellie carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to survive life's storms. Her dark hair was streaked with silver and pulled back into a tight braid, and she wore a simple gray wool sweater over faded jeans. Widowed young, she had raised 2 sons alone before losing one to the very war Logan had fought in. Since then, she had become a fixture of quiet kindness in Silver Creek, known for helping others while never asking for help herself. She looked up from the ledger she was writing in, and her eyes immediately softened as she noticed Blaze standing hesitantly behind Logan, head low but alert. "That's a beautiful shepherd," she said gently, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had known both love and loss. Logan gave a small nod. "His name's Blaze." Ellie stepped around the counter, moving slowly so as not to startle the dog. She crouched at a distance, her hand extended. "Hello, Blaze," she said softly. "You've seen some things, haven't you?" Boy Blaze looked to Logan first, and with a faint nod from his companion, he took a cautious step toward Ellie. She didn't push, didn't try to touch him. She simply waited, her presence a quiet invitation. Logan watched in silence as Blaze slowly closed the gap, finally pressing his nose gently into Ellie's open palm. It was a small gesture, but to Logan, it felt monumental. "That's how it starts," Ellie said, rising to her feet and meeting Logan's eyes. Small steps. Logan felt a tightness in his chest he hadn't expected. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, small steps." As the sun dipped behind the mountains that evening, Logan and Blaze returned to the cabin. That night, as Logan lay in bed and the familiar grip of his nightmares tried to pull him under a warm, solid weight settled across his feet, Blaze had climbed onto the end of the bed, his steady breathing a quiet reminder that neither of them had to face the darkness alone anymore. The blizzard returned with a vengeance that night, blanketing Silver Creek beneath a suffocating quilt of snow and silence. Outside Logan Hayes' cabin, the wind screamed like a mournful specter roaming the desolate mountains. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the only sound the ragged, shallow breaths of Blaze, who lay curled near the fire, his body racked by fever. Logan sat on the floor beside him, his back pressed against the stone hearth, eyes burning from exhaustion. His fingers trembled as he dipped a cloth into a bowl of cool water, wringing it out before gently laying it across Blaze's burning forehead. The dog's body was hot to the touch, His breathing labored every rise and fall of his chest, a cruel reminder of how close death hovered. Dr. Emily Carter had come earlier that evening, bringing what medicine she could, but the fever hadn't broken, and now the fight felt hopeless. "You've done all you can," she had whispered before leaving, her green eyes filled with the same helpless sorrow Logan had seen too many times in the field. Now it's up to him. But Logan couldn't accept that. Not after everything. Not after Blaze had fought so hard to live. He stared into the flickering flames, his mind drifting back to the last time he'd felt this helpless in the crumbling remains of a bombed-out building in Kandahar. It had been Ethan's final night. His best friend, his brother in arms. Pinned beneath rubble blood, seeping through his uniform eyes, already distant. Logan had knelt beside him, hands pressed hard against a wound too deep to save whispering promises he couldn't keep. "I'm right here, Ethan. Stay with me." But no miracle had come that night. Now, with Blaze's life slipping through his fingers, Logan felt the same crushing weight settle over his chest. His heart thudded painfully as he leaned closer to Blaze, his voice cracking as he spoke into the cold, heavy air. "Don't you do this to me," he rasped, his hand resting against the dog's heaving side. "You're not going out like this, not after everything we've been through." Blaze let out a faint whimper, his eyes fluttering open for the briefest moment before closing again. Logan did something he hadn't done since that night in the sand, and blood he fell to his knees beside the frail body of his companion, clasped his hands tightly together, and bowed his head. He had no eloquent words, no rehearsed prayers, just a broken plea whispered into the crackling air. "Please, don't take him. I couldn't save Ethan, but just this once, let me save someone." Outside the storm howled, but inside the cabin the fire seemed to burn brighter, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. Logan stayed there through the night, his knees aching against the hard wooden floor, his head bowed low beside the fragile rise and fall of Blaze's chest. At some point, sleep claimed him, in the early hours, his head resting against Blaze's side. And it was then, in the first quiet moments of dawn, that the storm broke. A pale golden light seeped through the frost-covered windows, casting a gentle glow over the cabin. Logan stirred, his body stiff and cold, and when he opened his eyes, he found himself staring directly into the deep amber gaze of Blaze. The fever had broken. Blaze's breathing was steady, his body no longer burning with the fire of sickness. He shifted weakly his head, pressing against Logan's chest in a gesture of quiet trust. Logan let out a shaky breath, a laugh that was half a sob, his eyes flooding with tears. He didn't fight this time. "You stubborn, beautiful soldier," he whispered, pulling the dog gently into his arms. "You made it." Blaze let out a low, contented sigh, and closed his eyes this time, not from exhaustion, but from the simple peace of survival. For the first time in years, Logan allowed himself to cry openly, not for the past, not for the lives lost, but for the life he had saved. And in that fragile dawn light, something within him began to heal. Outside, the snow sparkled beneath a cloudless sky, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Logan saw the day not as a burden, but as a gift. The snow had begun to thaw around Silver Creek, but the air remained bitter sharp with the lingering bite of winter. Logan Hayes stood at the edge of the forest. Blaze by his side, the dog's ears pricked forward, his body tense. The morning sun glinted off the melting icicles that hung like fragile daggers from the bare branches. Yet even in this fragile moment of spring's promise, something darker stirred in the shadows. Blaze had become restless over the past days. He would pace near the cabin door, nose lifted to the wind muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Logan recognized the signs. Blaze had caught a scent, something familiar and haunting. And this morning, without warning, Blaze took off through the thinning snow, his powerful legs carrying him toward the dense woods. Logan didn't hesitate. With his coat hastily thrown over his shoulders and his boots crunching through the frost-hardened earth, he followed the trail blazed by the German shepherd. They crossed the half-frozen creek, moved beyond the remnants of the collapsed mining shacks, and plunged deeper into a part of the forest few dared enter. It wasn't long before Blaze slowed his head, low body crouched, as if the weight of the air itself had grown heavier. Logan crouched beside him, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape. That's when he saw it, a faint path through the undergrowth, recent boot prints half hidden beneath a dusting of snow. The trail led them to an old abandoned lumber mill, its skeletal remains looming against the gray sky. Broken windows gaped like hollow eyes, and the sagging roof was covered in patches of rotted timber. Logan's fists clenched at his sides. He had seen this kind of place before in war zones, where suffering was hidden in plain sight. Moving cautiously, Logan approached the rusted door. Blaze stayed close, his body a tense line of readiness. Logan pushed the door open, the rusted hinges groaning. A wave of putrid air hit them, an unmistakable stench of filth, fear, and despair. Inside, the darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by shafts of light filtering through the broken walls. Then the faint sound reached Logan's ears, soft whimpers, the clink of chains against concrete. Logan's gut twisted as his eyes adjusted. Against the far wall, barely visible in the shadows, were rows of cages crudely welded from scrap metal, and within them, dozens of German shepherds, their eyes reflecting the faint light like twin lanterns of suffering. Some were little more than skin and bone, their fur matted with blood and filth. Others bore fresh wounds, the unmistakable marks of abuse and forced fighting. Blaze let out a low, guttural growl, his entire body trembling. Logan rested a calming hand on his back, but kept his gaze locked on the horror before him. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing. Within moments, Dr. Emily Carter answered, her voice sharp with concern. "Logan, what's wrong? Bring the sheriff," he said flatly. "We found them." While waiting for help to arrive, Logan moved carefully through the room, his heart breaking at each cage he passed. Some dogs shrank from him, flinching at every movement. Others lifted their heads weakly, their eyes dull but pleading. One cage near the back held a small pup, barely 6 months old. His fur, once surely a proud golden coat, was now ragged and dull. His front leg hung at an odd angle, broken and left untreated. Logan knelt before the cage, his voice soft. "Hang on, little one," he whispered. "You're going to get out of here." Outside, sirens broke the heavy silence. Sheriff Dean Mercer, a man in his early 50s with a square jaw and the permanent scowl of someone who had seen too much wrong and too little right, entered the mill alongside Emily Carter. Dean had a broad, imposing figure wrapped in a heavy leather sheriff's coat, his gray eyes scanning the scene with professional detachment that quickly gave way to disgust. "God almighty," he muttered under his breath, pulling his radio to call for backup and animal control units. Emily pushed past him, her face pale but determined. She knelt beside Logan, her experienced hands already checking the worst cases. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she examined the small pup with the broken leg. "We'll need to move fast," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "They won't survive much longer in here." As the authorities worked, Logan stood back and took it all in, his hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a business of suffering. And somewhere behind all of this filth and misery, there were people who thought nothing of trading life for profit. A noise behind him made Logan turn. Ellie Winters stood just beyond the entrance, her face pale against the dark wood of the mill. She had followed the sirens, a worn wool coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. Her brown eyes, always calm and deep, now brimmed with unshed tears. "How do people become this monstrous?" she asked quietly. Logan shook his head, his voice low and rough. "They don't become monsters, Ellie. They choose to be." She nodded slowly, stepping forward to kneel beside one of the cages. Her fingers slipped through the bars, gently stroking the trembling head of a young female shepherd with a deep gash across her shoulder. And in that moment, Logan saw it again, that silent strength in Ellie, the resilience of someone who had endured her own losses and yet found the courage to offer kindness despite the pain. As the last of the dogs were carried out into the waiting warmth of rescue trucks, Logan turned back for one final look. The mill stood empty now, the cages abandoned, but the echoes of suffering remained, and Logan knew he couldn't walk away from this, not yet. Outside, as the sky turned to twilight, Logan stood beside Blaze. The dog lifted his head and pressed it against Logan's leg, as if grounding them both against the dark memories that threatened to rise. Logan placed his hand on Blaze's head, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. "It's not over," he murmured, "not until they answer for this." The air was razor-sharp, every breath a struggle against the frozen sting that settled deep in the lungs. The snow, fresh and unmarked from a night's heavy storm, blanketed the Montana forest in a deceptive calm. But beneath that quiet beauty, something dark stirred. Logan Hayes stood at the edge of the tree line, his breath hanging in frosty clouds, his eyes fixed on the old mill's hidden entrance. Beside him, Blaze crouched low, his muscles coiled with tension, every nerve attuned to the danger ahead. Sheriff Dean Mercer had organized the raid swiftly. With Logan's intel and Blaze's uncanny tracking, they had pinpointed the last operational hideout of the illegal dogfighting ring. This time, they wouldn't arrive too late. Logan scanned the officers moving silently through the trees, their rifles slung low, faces set with grim purpose. And there among them was Ellie Winters, unexpected but unflinching, her slender form wrapped in a thick, faded army green coat, her dark braid tucked under a knit cap. Her eyes held the same quiet steel Logan had seen in soldiers on their final stand. Blaze stiffened his ears, snapping forward. Logan crouched beside him, his hand resting lightly on the dog's scarred back. "You ready for this, soldier?" he whispered. Blaze's amber eyes met his, and with a barely perceptible nod, the German shepherd crept forward, leading the way through the silent snow. The first sounds of struggle shattered the stillness. A sharp bark, a muffled shout. Logan's heart pounded as they neared the clearing where the ringleaders had hidden their last stock of dogs. From the trees he caught sight of a man dragging a small shepherd pup by the scruff of its neck. The pup, a scrawny, trembling thing barely old enough to stand, whimpered weakly. Logan recognized him instantly. Rusty. Without waiting for a command, Blaze broke from cover. His powerful legs churned through the snow, a low, feral growl ripping from his throat. The man turned eyes wide, a knife glinting in his hand. Everything slowed. Logan's mind snapped back to a different time, a different battlefield. Kandahar. The dust, the chaos, the scream of gunfire. He was back there frozen as his best friend Ethan charged through the hail of bullets to pull a trapped comrade free. Logan saw it again, the blade flashing, the enemy lunging. Ethan's cry, blood soaking the sand. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and this time, fate would write a different ending. The man lunged at Blaze, the knife flashing toward the dog's side, but Blaze was faster. He twisted midair, teeth bared latching onto the man's wrist with savage precision. Still, the knife found its mark, a shallow but painful cut across Blaze's flank. Logan's vision cleared his body, propelled by pure instinct. He moved faster than he had in years, crossing the distance in a heartbeat. His fist connected hard with the attacker's jaw, sending the man sprawling into the snow. Sheriff Mercer's deputies swarmed in, securing the area. Logan dropped to his knees beside Blaze, his hands trembling as they pressed against the bleeding wound. "Stay with me," he whispered hoarsely. "Not today. You hear me? Not today." Blaze's breathing was shallow, his body tense from pain, but his eyes, those fierce, determined eyes, remained locked on Logan's. Rusty, the tiny shepherd pup, crawled toward them, whining softly, nuzzling against Blaze's side. Ellie Winters knelt beside Logan, her gloved hands already working to bind the wound. "It's not deep," she said, her voice steady, despite the panic flashing in her dark eyes. "He's going to be okay." Logan swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. His mind kept flashing between the present and that blood-soaked battlefield years ago. But this time, the story didn't end in loss. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind the snow-covered peaks, the operation was declared a success. The ringleaders had been captured, dozens of dogs rescued from a life of brutality. The old mill was silent now, its dark secrets laid bare. Back at the cabin, Blaze rested on his blanket by the fire, his wound cleaned and stitched. Rusty lay curled against him, the small pup unwilling to leave his side. Logan sat nearby, his eyes never straying far from the dog who had saved so many lives and nearly lost his own. Ellie entered quietly, carrying a fresh bowl of water. She knelt beside Blaze, her fingers running gently over his fur. "You're a hero, you know that," she whispered. Logan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. "He's more than that," he said softly. "He's the reason I believe there's still something good left in this world." Ellie turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You're part of that good, Logan. Don't forget it." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, gentle flakes drifting down, like fragile reminders that, even after the harshest storms, there could still be peace. The night bled into dawn, under a curtain of endless snow. Silver Creek lay buried beneath a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional moan of the wind twisting through frozen trees. In the dimly lit veterinary clinic, Logan Hayes sat motionless on a wooden bench outside the operating room, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles white against the strain of his quiet desperation. Through the frosted window, he could just make out the silhouette of Dr. Emily Carter, her shoulders hunched over Blaze's still body on the surgical table. The sterile lights above cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to flicker with every passing second, each one a silent reminder that life hung precariously on the edge of loss. Blaze hadn't woken since the attack. The blood loss had been more severe than Emily originally thought, and the wound had reopened during the rushed journey back to the clinic. Despite the cold, a fine sheen of sweat covered Logan's brow. His mind spiraled through every dark corner it had ever known, Kandahar, the final cries of his fallen brothers, the moments where no prayer had been answered. But this time, he couldn't accept defeat. For the first time in more years than he could remember, Logan rose from the bench and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Silver Creek's small chapel. It was an old structure built with weathered stone and stained glass windows dulled by time. Despite the cold outside, the interior was warm, lit only by a handful of flickering candles near the altar. Logan moved slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. His gaze fell upon the tarnished brass plaque at the altar's base, a dedication to the fallen soldiers of wars long past. His fingers grazed the rough edges of the engraved names, memories of his own fallen comrades pressing heavily against his heart. He took a candle from the brass holder, his fingers trembling slightly as he lit it, and placed it gently among the others. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the stillness of that chapel, it sounded like a confession carried on the wind. Please, not this time. I've lost too many. Don't take him too. His eyes closed, and for a brief fragile moment, the iron walls around his heart cracked. There, kneeling beneath the old oak cross, Logan Hayes allowed himself to believe that miracles, though rare and hard-fought, might still find their way through the darkest storms. Outside, the snow began to ease, falling softer like feathers instead of daggers. Logan stood and made his way back to the clinic, his boots dragging through the slush as the first pale light of dawn broke across the horizon. He had barely crossed the threshold of the clinic when the door to the operating room creaked open. Emily Carter stood there, her surgical mask pulled down around her neck, her green eyes red-rimmed, but alight with a spark of hope. Logan's heart seized in his chest. He made it. She whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own exhaustion and relief. Logan, he's alive. Logan didn't realize he was moving until he found himself standing at the doorway, staring down at Blaze. The dog lay wrapped in warm blankets, his breathing shallow but steady. When Logan knelt beside him, Blaze's eyes fluttered open, faint but focused, and his tail gave the weakest of thumps against the blanket. A broken laugh, raw and thick with emotion, escaped Logan's throat. He pressed his forehead gently against Blaze's, his voice hoarse. "You stubborn bastard!" he whispered, tears falling freely now. "You came back." Blaze let out a low, contented sigh and drifted back into peaceful sleep, his body finally at rest after the long, brutal night. Later that afternoon, as the snow continued to melt under the hesitant warmth of early spring, the town gathered near the clinic. Word of Blaze's survival had spread quickly, and for the first time in years, Logan stood among his neighbors not as a ghost of war, but as a man present alive, and part of something larger than himself. Ellie Winters approached him near the clinic steps. Her face, framed by her dark braid and softened by the afternoon light, held a knowing smile. She stood beside him quietly, her hands tucked into the pockets of her old coat. "You're different today," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of truths left unsaid. Logan exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe I'm finally coming home," he admitted. Ellie nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Welcome back, Logan?" Spring came slowly to Silver Creek, not with grand declarations, but through subtle moments, the hesitant bloom of wildflowers along the forest's edge, the soft rustle of new leaves unfurling beneath the stubborn frost. And for the first time in many years, Logan Hayes stood amidst that fragile beauty, and saw not the remnants of what was lost, but the promise of what could be rebuilt. The old lumber mill, once a place of suffering and darkness, had been transformed. With the combined efforts of Silver Creek's townsfolk, led by Sheriff Dean Mercer, Ellie Winters, and Dr. Emily Carter, the place was reborn as the Last Stand sanctuary. Wooden fences had replaced rusted chains. Open fields now stretched where cages once stood. The scent of fresh-cut timber and blooming sagebrush filled the air, chasing away the ghosts that had long haunted the land. Logan stood at the front gate, his broad shoulders relaxed for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. His face, still lined with the harshness of years spent in battle both abroad and within, held a softness that hadn't been there before. Beside him, Blaze sat tall and proud, the long scar along his side, a badge of honor, not shame. His fur shone in the golden afternoon light, his eyes calm but alert, watching over the new home he now shared with those who needed it most. The sanctuary had become a refuge for both animals and people lost souls trying to stitch their lives back together. Veterans from all across the state had begun to visit, some staying on to help build others, simply sitting quietly with the dogs, sharing their unspoken grief and healing in the warmth of unconditional companionship. Rusty, the tiny shepherd pup, once left to die, had grown stronger under Blaze's careful watch. His leg, now straightened and healed, thanks to Emily's tireless care, carried him confidently across the open fields. He rarely left Blaze's side, following him like a shadow of hope wherever he went. That afternoon, a new arrival came through the sanctuary gates. A tall figure stepped out of an old blue pickup truck, his uniform still bearing the faded insignia of a U.S. Marine. His name was Thomas Graves, a man with hard lines etched into his dark-skinned face, his eyes carrying the same haunted weight Logan had once worn. He walked with a limp, the result of a roadside bomb in Kabul, and though his body was battered, there was a quiet dignity in his every step. Logan met him halfway across the yard, his hand extended. "Welcome to the last stand," he said simply. Thomas shook his hand firmly, his voice low and rough. "Heard about what you built here. Figured it was time to stop running and find some peace." Logan nodded, his gaze flicking toward the fields where Sophie Carter played quietly near the flower beds, her golden hair catching the sunlight. She had come to the sanctuary often since Blaze's recovery, and with each visit her silence had grown shorter, her eyes brighter. That day, for the first time, she had run her small hands across the sanctuary's entrance sign and whispered just loud enough for Logan to hear home. It was a moment that had nearly broken him. Now, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in brilliant hues of amber and rose, Logan stood on the porch of the newly built main lodge. The sanctuary stretched before him, alive with movement and light. Dogs barked playfully in the distance, their voices no longer cries for help, but songs of freedom. Blaze stood beside him, regal and unbowed, his scar a silver thread beneath his thick fur. And then, from across the porch, a voice broke the hush of twilight. "Blaze." The single word carried through the air, soft but clear. Logan turned, his breath catching. Sophie stood near the porch steps, her small frame trembling, her face flushed with the courage it took to finally break her long-held silence. Tears welled in Logan's eyes as he knelt, opening his arms. Sophie ran to him, her tiny voice breaking again through the years of quiet. "Blaze, I knew you'd come back." The great shepherd moved forward, gently pressing his head into Sophie's chest. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, and for the first time since her father's death, she found her voice guided not by force, but by the quiet love of a friend who had survived his own storms. Logan stood slowly, his heart full in a way it had never been. Ellie Winters approached quietly from behind her hand, finding his. Her presence was steady, warm, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "This place isn't just for them, Logan," she said softly. "It's for all of us." And as the last light of the day faded behind the mountains, Logan understood. The sanctuary wasn't just a refuge, it was a reminder that healing didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, in tentative steps, in whispered names, spoken after years of silence. Blaze stood on the hilltop above the sanctuary that night, the wind carrying his proud silhouette against the twilight sky. His scar glinted under the stars, not as a mark of suffering, but as a beacon of survival. And Logan knew deep in his bones that they had all found their way home at last. Sometimes the deepest scars aren't the ones we see, but the ones we quietly carry within. And yet, even the most broken souls, whether human or animal, can find their way back to the light when someone chooses to believe in them. Like Logan, Blaze, and little Sophie, we all face moments when the weight of the past feels unbearable. But sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with a quiet act of kindness, a hand reaching out in the dark, or simply the courage to try again. If you're standing at the edge of your own storm, right now, remember, no winter lasts forever, and no heart is too broken to heal. Like Blaze, wear your scars with pride. They are not marks of weakness, but living proof that you endured, that you survived, and most of all, that you are still worthy of love. And if this story touched something deep within, you don't let it end here. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that hope is real. Leave a comment and tell us what's the scar you've learned to wear with pride. And if you believe that second chances can change lives just like they did for Blaze Logan and Sophie, hit that subscribe button and stay with us as we continue sharing true stories of healing and redemption. Because sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear capes, they simply walk quietly beside us on four legs, reminding us that home isn't a place. It's the moment we finally feel safe enough to heal. So, before you go, tell us, what does home mean to you? We're listening.